We're getting a state visit from Japan this week to discuss everything Japan and economic security, from export controls and chip policy, as well as some lessons from the 1930s and even space policy. We have a treat today with Kazuto Suzuki. Suzuki-san is a professor at the University of Tokyo, an advisor to METI and Japan's space program, and he also recently established the Institute of Geoeconomics at the International House of Japan. Co-hosting today is Arrian Ebrahimi, student at Yenching Academy and author of the Chip Capitols Substack. Welcome to Chinatalk, you two.
Thank you very much for inviting me. The discussion of economic security started like 2020 during the COVID, but the initial concerns about the economic security started in 2010 when Japanese Coast Guard has arrested the captain of the fishing boat from China, which collided with the Coast Guard vessel around the Senkaku Island. This incident has become as a big national or issue between Japan and China. And when China has demanded the release of the captain, they stopped exporting the rare earth mineral to Japan. And rare earth mineral is a critical mineral to the hybrid cars. So the Japanese cars automobile industry has been damaged quite a bit. And ever since, Japanese businesses as well as politics understands that, China does not afraid of using such blunt method to coerce Japan using the economic relationship or the interdependence. There was a shortage of masks during the COVID, and we realized that the production of the masks were concentrated in China, and that reminded us that if we depend too much on China, then there'll be a possibility that the China will use this as the leverage to, put pressure on Japanese government to change its policy. So the government and the majority party has discussed about Economic Security Promotion Act, which was established in 2022. And since then, there is a lot of efforts were made to improve the resilience of the supply chain. There is a shared memory among the Japanese businesses as well as the government that there is always a threat that China will use as economy as a weapon.
Yeah. So let's stay on the sort of like broader political economy questions before we get to the actual
Hmm.
legislation. Like, look, you created an Institute of Geoeconomics. You're probably pretty far on one side of the spectrum of like caring about these sorts of things. And,
Yeah.
obviously there are going to be kind of different levels of pain tolerance because
Hmm.
doing economic security is like, often not the most, efficient, straightforward, short-term profit making decision,
Hmm.
and
Right.
requires both government and corporate outlays. So, can you talk a little bit about maybe like the public, the politicians, and particular companies that are sort of more or less enthusiastic about this broader frame and thinking about Japan's interaction with China and the rest of the world?
Well, I think there's no enthusiasm in it. I think people are just simply being afraid of the bad thing happen. And, I think it's just more precautionary approach to mitigate the risks. So if you chase after the short-term benefit, dealing with China may brought you some goodies, but the problem is if you depend heavily on China, then you'll be punished. People are trying to find a balance, and as Jake Sullivan said, it's a small yard, high fence. People try to make that sensitive part as small as possible, and try to build up a higher fence to protect those sensitive information.
Well, let's talk about that fence for a second. So, over the course of the Biden administration, there has been a lot of effort in the White House and in the Commerce Department to get Japan and the Netherlands to go
Hmm.
along with export controls around semiconductor manufacturing equipment in particular.
Right.
Um, I heard some interest. I remember reading some articles about, on the one hand, like it's almost easier for Japan if the US is the one like strong arming them into doing a thing because it's sort of less scary to do it on your own. But also, you've seen a lot of pushback from the likes of Tokyo Electron and others who are set to lose out on billions of dollars of revenue from the restriction. So yeah, sort of curious, reflecting over the past few years, like how has the sort of how has the SME equipment export control story played out from your perspective?
On the one hand, yes, the US pressure was the good excuse for the Tokyo Electron and the Japanese government to accept the idea of limiting the export of the high-end, the manufacturing equipment to the high-end chips. But the probably it's not because we are trying to hide behind the United States when we confront with China. I think there's a too much play up on this China retaliation theory. I mean, China is using the economic coercion anyhow. I mean, they are just doing that, even if it's a retaliation or non-retaliation, it doesn't matter. They are just simply using the economic coercion as the tools to promote their own policy. So in that sense, I think the retaliation theory is not a major theory in Japan. I think it's more of a case that it's easier to convince the stockholders, shareholders were concerned about these. The Japanese government tried to set up the export control regulations to China, which is a profitable market, but if it's a U.S. pressure, then shareholders may understand that, okay, if it's against the, we are not trying to fight against the U.S. demand, so we accept this new regulations.
So, what's the Economic Security Act?
So it's an economic security promotion act. So it's to promote the idea of improving the resilience of the supply chain, which means that we are not trying to limit the imports of Chinese products, but to incentivize the companies to find alternative sources of the supply. So it's not the tariff, or it's not the restriction of the imports, but it's more like an encouragement for the Japanese companies to find alternatives. And the Japanese government will provide the subsidies for the R&D for finding alternative minerals or alternative methods of production of particular products, which depends heavily on the Chinese import from China. And also there are encouragement for the finding the alternative suppliers of the minerals or other stuff in the friendly countries like Australia, Canada, and Philippines or Southeast Asia. So these are the kind of first pillar of the ESPA, the Economic Security Promotion Act. The second pillar, there are four pillars, and the second pillar is the protection of the critical infrastructure. And this is not the physical protection, but it is the protection from the illicit contract, which may penetrate into the critical infrastructure. The third pillar is to conceal the patents, because some of the patents have the dual use capabilities or the military use. The fourth pillar is the promotion of the R&D and trying to promote the Japanese industry to be more autonomous from the supply from other countries, particularly from China, but also try to gain the indispensability, which means that Japan try to be more, indispensable in the global supply chain and try to make other countries depend on us. So that would reduce the risks of being coerced by others, because we do have the sort of retaliatory means. If they just if they start stopping export to Japan, then we can stop exporting to that country. So this is a sort of a tit for tat mechanism for deterring the exercise of the economic coercion. So currently there is something called the KPRO, that's the Economic Security Related Technology R&D program, and this is the focusing on the 11 different categories of the technical area, including space, of course, the semiconductor, cloud services, etc., and try to create the more autonomous capabilities of supply chain, and also try to gain some indispensability.
You just
Mhm.
described K-Pro and the legislation as well, and we see it seems to be a mix of different protect and promote provisions, both provisions protecting Japanese technology as well as those which seek to promote Japan's domestic development of new technology.
Right.
How did this come to being? What are the different political groupings in the Diet, for example, the Japanese legislature, when it comes to economic national security? For example, in a neighbor of yours, South Korea, one party is relatively dovish on protect policies, while they also have divides on how to promote technology domestically. How does this occur in Japan?
I think the political intervention is much less. It is more of a mixture of the industrial promotion. I wouldn't say it's lobbying, but there are a number of cases that different companies and different industry are promoting the idea of what to do with the idea of this, the promote or protect. I think at the end of the day, it is up to the bureaucrats who makes the planning of this balance between the promote and protect. I mean, promote and protect has been always the on the agenda of the Economic Security Promotion Act. I mean, there's no sort of a one single objective. There are sort of a balanced objective to do both promotion and protection, but it's not a consequence of the political, football. But I think it's more about concerns that comes from the bureaucrats, and they do certain homework to find out what are the weaknesses or the vulnerability of the Japanese supply chain, and also they are looking at the potential of certain technologies for the future. So there is a very strong decision on the semiconductor, because there is a sort of a consensus among the political circle that we need to put the heavy subsidies on the semiconductor in order to restart the semiconductor industry in Japan. That's the political landscape in Japan. It's not a hawkish, dovish kind of confrontation. It is more about the balancing and the careful selection of the industry and technology in the view of the future potential of these industries and technologies can be critical for the Japanese economic growth.
So I have a divided son,
Hmm.
a sort of history of METI and Japanese industrial policy. They had a really great run in the 70s and 80s. Things got kind of sketchy in the 90s, and of course 2000s and 2010s. Are the bureaucrats, like, excited to, like, get money to spend again? I mean, this must be like a bit of a renaissance, for, sort of like industrial policy and promotion, both on the protect and promote side. It's never it hasn't been this fun to work at METI in, like, 40 years, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly true. I think what is interesting is that this is a well, it's a renaissance of the industrial policy, but you know the post World War II period, I mean, 1950s, 60s, 70s, these are the time that, Japan was heavily investing by, the METI, or then called METI, was the sort of a leading figure for the coordination, the prioritization, and they are the ones to use the subsidies to make the Japanese industry going, and which was successful. But there is always a price for success, and that price was the confrontation with the United States. So trade friction in 1980s, this the SII, this economic confrontation with the United States made it. I mean, that was a big shift of the Japanese uh, bureaucrat-led economic system. So the bureaucrats shifted towards more neoliberal, less intervention, deregulation kind of uh, market-oriented economic style, which means that METI and the entire government is lifting their hands from the market, and which was, I think, which was a reasonable policy because the world is getting more global. The government controls were more limited, and I think in 1990s, 2010s, this is the sort of a sort of a golden age of the globalization. Everyone is just expanding, investing in other countries, and without government intervention. So the government was just simply let the industry to take, their role, and and make them more global. If government is trying to do the sort of a traditional industrial policy, those are being, catastrophically failure. I mean, those are ended in a failure because the companies were not depending on the Japanese government. But I think the tide has changed ever since 2010, when China started to use the economy as a weapon. And then, the arrival of the Donald Trump in the White House has changed the whole concept of the globalization, because, he is just simply using the tariffs and the regulations, and, he was deregulating in many sense, those environmental regulations, the safety regulation, and all that. But reinstated the national regulations, and the Biden administration has put more emphasis on the government-led, subsidies and industrial policy. So I think the now, the United States, which criticized Japan doing too much industrial policy, and the industrial policy was demonized during Reagan administration, but now it's the United States which leads the industrial policy. And the government, Japanese bureaucrats are not excited by this change, but they are saying that, oh my God, we need to do more work. So it's a kind of a revival of the hard days work in during 1960s and 70s. They were happy to do that because they see the growth of Japanese economy. But
Sure.
now we are doing something to prevent the economic coercion, try to be more resilient, not asking industry not to invest too much in China, but to buy the goods from somewhere else, which is more expensive. And these are not something exciting. So this is an
Yeah.
industrial policy in a different ways. It is more about driven by the concerns of security, not the growth of economy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's probably true for the sort of economic security law stuff, but like, it's been, I think, with Kumamoto, with Hokkaido and Rapidus, I imagine it's a bit of a different dynamic. And what's been sort of, of just like writing multi-billion-dollar checks to companies, and what's been sort of interesting is seeing that METI like kind of remembered some of the moves from the MIDI days, whereas the U.S. government and CHIPS Act has kind of really had to start from scratch in
Yeah.
understanding and thinking about different parameters of how to engage with the companies and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that in Kumamoto, we are paying the checks to the TSMC, not the Japanese company.
Yeah.
So it's a different stuff. I mean, we are not promoting the Japanese company being global or being competitive. We are just inviting the TSMC for the better sake of the security of supply. So that's a totally different story. Yes, Rapidus is a typical, industrial policy, investing, trying to do something new, try to be the cutting edge of the semiconductor, 2 nanometers or beyond 2 nanometers. Yeah, that's an exciting part. But the problem is that, Rapidus, of course, it depends on the government subsidies, but they are more depending on the foreign partners like IBM, IMEC, or ASML. You know, you can't just be the Japanese company. I mean, this is a global company from the birth, and it's they just need money to kickstart with the new factory, but their their aim is a global market, and their partnership is global. So basically, from a METI's point of view, they are just writing a check for Rapidus, and of course, it creates jobs and it creates dynamics in the economy, and the Hokkaido economy needs to have some sort of a stimulus. So I think this is useful for the local economy, but that's it. I mean, that's not the industrial policy. That's employment policy, job security, not the economic
Ooh,
security. So basically, I think this is a totally different story from the 1950s and 60s.
harsh. I love it. All right. Well,
I mean, I'm not trying to be, cynical about this. I'm just trying to be analytical. I
yeah.
mean, trying to make a differences. I mean, trying to see the difference. I mean, this is not just simple, return. Of course, we do know how to deal with the industry, and the Japanese government is very good at communicating with industry, and the industry is also good at listening to the government objectives and try to cooperate with government. So I mean, I think in the United States, the relationship between government and industry is more confrontational, whereas in Japan, it's more fluid. I mean, it's not really, kind of a flashy confrontation. It's more like a cooperation partnership between the government and the industry. But again, comparing to the Japanese traditional industrial policy in the past, I think this one is different.
That's awesome. All right. Well, I was also kind of sketched out by putting it in Hokkaido. I mean, like, come on, guys. That's some ridiculous like idea. But anyways, we're gonna have some Rapidus folks on later this year, and they can defend their honor
Really?
from Suzuki-san's grave critiques. Ariane, you want to talk about Wasana, right?
Yeah, so we just went through a bit of history with regards to Japan and its internal industrial policy. But
Mhm,
concurrent to all of that, we had another parallel line of history going on in the development of export control. The development of the
mhm,
Wassenaar Agreement, which notably includes Russia,
mhm,
mainly as a mechanism for multilateral export controls on weapons. That regime shaped many of the export control regimes in member countries to Wassenaar, including the United States, Japan, etc. But now, people in Washington and capitals around the world say that Wassenaar is obsolete
mhm,
for the uh, issues that semiconductor and that export controls are being used for now, namely economic security, a whole new concept, and
mhm.
frankly, for the alignment of nations in geopolitics. What did Wassenaar mean to Japan? How has Wassenaar shaped Japan's export control regime? And how do we move forward in Tokyo for an export control regime uh, in the world's current geopolitical alignment?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's exactly what we are discussing at the government level. By the way, full disclosure, I am a member of the METI's Council on the Industrial Policy, and I'm a member of the branch of the uh, security trade, and so I'm well. It's a security trade policy branch. So I'm partially responsible for the decision making on the export control policy in Japan. But nevertheless, I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not reflecting on the government position. Um, uh, so the Wassenaar has been the sort of a centerpiece of the Japanese export control on for the dual use items. It has been integrated into Japanese law called the foreign exchange foreign trade law. This is similar to the European export control regime, although the numbering and the details are different. But the primary concept is that to integrate the regime's export control list into the Japanese law. So it's not just Wassenaar, it's NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, Australia Group, and MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime. So all these four regimes are integrated into the foreign exchange, foreign trade law, and this is the basic, framework for the Japanese export control. So Japanese export control law basically is aiming at prevention of the proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction. So that's the primary objective, and that hasn't changed, at least legally. So United States has a flexible export control mechanism. You have EPA, you have EAR, you have a whole bunch of executive orders and everything. So it's much easier to shift the objective of the export control from the prevention of the proliferation to the use of the export control as the prevention of the national, aiming at the national security policy. Not just export control, but the United States also has the flexibility in the tariff policy. So if you are using the Article 232 of the trade expansion law, you are, if the president decides this item is about this a matter of national security, you can increase the tariff. So the steel and aluminum was the case when the Trump came into power, and Biden continued this application of the additional tariff on the steel and aluminum. So these kind of things doesn't exist in Japan. We don't use tariffs as well as export control for the national objective. Tariff is controlled by the WTO, and that there is a certain level of the
For now.
international agreement for now. I mean, at least for now, Japanese law is abided by, and is strongly linked to the the WTO, so as the export control rules. So when the United States asking Japan to change the export control regulations, that was the first time that we are including something that is not decided by the international regime. So adding the semiconductor manufacturing equipments and the other, total 23 items to the list was the first time that Japan's doing the export control change of the export control regulations without the consent of the regime. Now we are thinking, we do agree that the Wassenaar is obsolete. It's not working. Russia, it requires a unanimous decision. So basically, as long as you have Russia in it, then there is no decision at Wassenaar. So basically, the Wassenaar regime is all about, just talk shop, and no decisions will be made. But we need to have an effective export control, and we need to make sure that we don't want to use the export control as a weapon to, coerce against other country. We did that in 2019 And that was a sort of a very tricky situation when Japan and South Korea relationship was too bad, and the Prime Minister Abe wanted to find some other ways to send a message to South Korea and change the export control mechanism, not the law, but to replace the South Korea or take out the South Korea from the white list, so-called white list, which is sort of a privileged position in the export control procedures, and to put it in the second ranking country. So that hurt the pride of the South Korean people, and that was some sort of a use of the export control as a weapon to change the course of the diplomatic relationship. That was not really successful because the South Korean didn't really respond it to, but just simply fuel the anger of the South Korean people. So I think it was a diplomatic failure, but nevertheless, I think that was the first time and the only time that Japan used the export control as the tools to change the course of the bilateral relationship. The future of the export control is going to be somewhat using the minilateral framework. Japan, US, Netherlands, trilateral agreement on the export control on the semiconductor was perhaps one of the model, but I don't think this is really convincing. And I don't think this is very effective, or it's effective in a way to prevent the transfer of the goods, the transfer of equipment to China. But I think it's not it's very unique in the case of the semiconductor manufacturing goods. So I think in order to have more universal, or let's say the more uh, applicable framework, we need to have something. I'm not really a big fan of IPEF, but that sort of a size, and about the 10 to 15 countries working together to have a certain objective of the control of the certain items for the sake of the security, and to prevent the sort of disruption of the international order. So I think we need to form as some sort of a minilateral framework for the further change of the Japanese law on the export control. We need to do that. I mean, we don't need to do. We can unilaterally change our law, but we don't want to do that. So I think it's better to have this sort of a certain legitimacy of the using the multilateral framework to change the export control framework.
Gotcha. All right, a lot to pick up from that. Let's start briefly on like the future of Korea-Japan relations. Like those export controls got taken off. We had Camp David. Things are looking up. Like how far can this little bromance go? And to what extent will it impact economic security related questions?
Well, how far it's going, I think we expect that at least the next 3 years, as long as President Yoon is in the brew house, or he's no longer in brew house, but as long as he's in the presidency, I think we do have an opportunity to have a good relationship with South Korea. And of course there is a much dire, changing security environment with North Korea, China. And I think what is remarkable during the Yoon administration, there is a much more significant change of the perception, South Korean perception on China. So they see China as the economic threat and economic. I mean, during the Moon Jae-in administration, the South Korean people believe that the China is the El Dorado. That's where you go. You can make money by, so the Samsung, SK Hynix, they built the factories here and there in China, and that was the sort of a winning shot for the semiconductor industry. But now they think that that's too much and that's too dangerous, that's too risky. So the South Koreans are now, well, they are not divesting, but they stop investing in China. And I think this is, I think, a change of perception of the industry, but also it's because of the President Yoon has brought this idea that there are certain aspects of China which is very dangerous, and we need to be more. The South Koreans needs to be more on the side of the United States and Japan to ensure they, extended deterrence and more, like-minded networks. The friend shoring partnership. These are the major shift of policy in South Korea, and I think that has been bearing some fruit. So I hope that the South Korean constituencies understand that this is the right way to go, and confronting with Japan would produce nothing. So I hope that this romance will continue even after the President Yoon leaves the office. But I think this will be, who knows? I mean, every time we expect something good happen to South Korea, and then suddenly the change of presidency, and then everything goes to back to start from scratch. And we have done this emotional surf ride. So I think we need to be more taking a very cautious approach. So I'm optimistically cautious, but we'll see.
Well, continuing our sort of, I don't know, couples therapy analogy, like to what extent do you think like Biden as therapist was helpful here, and would a Trump administration I don't know. There's a lot of things the Trump administration would do. But from the perspective of Japan-Korea relations, like do you think the US's role is critical not just to get the conversation going, but to keep it sort of on the right track going forward?
Oh yes, I mean the U.S. has a greater role to play. I mean, especially I'm worrying more about Trump's romance with Kim Jong Un. I mean, they are exchanging love letters, and they meet. They occasionally date in Singapore, Hanoi, and Panmunjom. So I think this romance between the Trump himself and the Kim Jong Un is going to be very problematic, because that is where we cannot agree on how to deal with North Korea. So I think this is going to be a very bigger role that the United States play. Not necessarily important, but I think it's there is always the United States plays as a role, but sometimes this role can be very disruptive, and probably it may consolidate the Japan-South Korea relationship. But who knows?
We've talked about South Korea and different countries' export control policies from two different lenses, both like the larger geopolitical lens, but also in the beginning of the conversation about the different natures of the chip industries in different countries.
Mhm.
Japan being more upstream focused with its equipment and
Mhm.
materials companies, and South Korea and Taiwan being more downstream focused with their chip makers. And then that gives them different stakes in the China market. Which force do you see as more important in shaping the future multilateral export control relationship with China, especially given the fact that South Korea and Taiwan, both their governments and their companies, lobbied heavily against the Bureau of Industry and Security in the US to get exemptions for Samsung and TSMC to the October 2022 export controls.
Yeah.
But Japan didn't push back as hard. Like, which forces are most important in this?
Well, I think South Korea and Taiwan has a sort of a different structure, but South Korea, it's an IDM, the integrated development and manufacturing mechanism. So the Samsung, Hynix are just doing everything on the stream from the up end to the downstream. whereas TSMC in Taiwan is basically doing, it's a foundry, so they're doing only manufacturing, but not, and they are both dependent on the Japanese material, Japanese equipment, as well as ASML in Netherlands. So I think there are certain level of um, dependence on Japan. And when it comes to the international competitiveness, uh, South Korea is facing a very difficult position because of the cost of producing um, uh, the chips within South Korea is getting higher and higher, whereas TSMC is facing the sort of a resource problem because the Taiwan is too small for the electricity, water, and the manpower. So Taiwan needs to, I mean, the TSMC needs to go beyond Taiwan, and that's one of the reasons why they invested in Kumamoto as a strategic center for production, because there is more water, there is more electricity available. So I think you know uh, uh, both Taiwan and South Korea are important, and they would have a power. But by the way, their lobbying against the BIS was more or less to maintain their manufacturing capability within China. They need to continue investing in the factories in order to maintain their production capabilities in China, and they wanted to have an exemption. So it's not asking for more, permission to invest more. It's more like a maintaining the current capacity, and sooner or later these capacity will go obsolete, and it's they need to do additional investment if they want to expand their business in China. But I don't think that neither Taiwan nor South Korea is demanding for further expansion of the existing production capacity in China. So I think that's a different story. Nobody can make the semiconductor alone. Everyone depends on everybody. So I think it is wrong to assume that one country can be a winner and the other country will be a loser, or one country can be a powerful and others just subordinate. I think everyone needs to be on depend on each other. Japanese equipment cannot exist without TSMC or Samsung, and the Samsung cannot exist without the Japanese equipment. So it's a mutual dependence, and I think it's not a win or lose or zero sum game. I think it's a plus sum game that if we work together, that will be the happy ending.
So, speaking of countries depending on each other, Ariane, why don't we get a little riff from your thesis about the Qing Dynasty in Japan?
In the late Qing Dynasty, during the self-strengthening movement, the Yanghu Yundong, there was a heavy reliance on Japanese naval technology by the Qing Dynasty to both guard against. Well, the Qing Dynasty wanted to strengthen its own naval capacity, so it relied on Japanese tech, German tech, American tech, and in the process of importing downstream shipbuilding and gun building manufacturing facilities, it became even more reliant on Japanese upstream imports for advanced materials and equipment. Is history repeating itself? Is China, in an effort to achieve the independence in the semiconductor industry or other industries, going to dig itself into a further hole?
Well, I mean, if you are in a confrontational relationship like the China and the West, I mean, China depends heavily on Western technology, Western supply, Western manufacturing equipment. So yes, I agree. I mean, I wasn't talking about China. I mean, I was talking about South Korea and Taiwan. So basically, we are not in confrontation. We are not trying to use that as the, trying to use this let's say, superiority in the supply chain to put the pressure on the other country. I think relationship with China is different, but um, China is capable of producing a legacy chips. I mean, they are making, they are capable of producing the massive level, massive amount of legacy chip, and they can do it in the cheapest way. So I think my concern is that it's not about the up end, the up and upstream control can control China, but I think I'm more concerned about China investing heavily on the legacy chips and try to dominate the legacy chip market and destroy all the other existing capabilities of other countries. I mean, Japan has the Renesas and the other companies which produces the legacy chip, and if we compete with Chinese production, we can't win. I mean, we can't survive.
So, fast forwarding from the Qing Dynasty to the
Mhm,
1930s, of course, you had a lot of focus domestically in Imperial Japan on self-reliance, as well as
mhm,
the U.S. government increasingly ratcheting up sanctions in response to activities in sort of Manchuria and China.
mhm,
And historians debate to what extent the oil export ban was like the trigger that ended up leading to Pearl Harbor and the start of the or sorry, I guess a new phase of the Pacific War in World War II. But I'm curious, you personally, maybe broader in Japan as well, like, do people see those analogies at all with respect to what the rest of the world is doing to China and creating this sense of like temporal claustrophobia and like peaking power as being a scary thing? Or is this ancient history we thankfully don't have to project all that much into the present?
I think the 1930s are used as a reference, used as more common reference to the current sanctions on Russia instead of China. I mean, what we are doing with China is not exactly sanctions, or we are trying to prevent the China to acquire the high-end chip capabilities just for the sake of reducing the Chinese military capabilities for using the AI and others. So it's more like a small yard issue. But
Yeah.
more comprehensive, much the relevance is more on the Russian sanctions, because I mean, of course, the Russia is the oil producing country, and Japan was oil importing country, and the oil sanctions or embargo was a serious hit to the Japanese economy, and that changed the whole idea of going to the north to going to the south, trying to invade in French Indochina or the Dutch colonies, etc., to gain access to the resources. Pearl Harbor is just another story, so it's not relevant in the whole series of discussion. But anyway, there was a clear evidence or clear connection between the sanctions and the Japanese decision to go into the Southeast Asia. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and I think there was a discussion in Japan that putting a harsh sanctions on Russia was creating putting the Russia into a corner, and then you know uh, forcing Russia to do something unusual or unthinkable, which is using a nuclear weapon. So there was a concern about using a reference of 1930s, that the imposing sanctions on Russia is not really a to what extent we can impose the sanctions on Russia. But at the end of the day, Russia is not using a nuclear weapon as of now, and Russia is still trading the oil to China, India, elsewhere. So they are not cornered in terms of the oil export. I mean, I'm not saying that the sanctions is useless, but I think sanction was different from the 1930s. So I think that sort of a reference is not really relevant. Um, so yes, I think from Japanese point of view, there's always a reference of 1930s when it comes to the question of the economic coercion, economic sanctions, and it's still, being a sort of a major, sort of a national memory of the disaster. So, uh, but but I think this argument is sort of separated from the question of economic security, because economic
Sure.
security issue argument is somewhat to avoid such, sanctions will be imposed on Japan. So, or even if there is a sanctions imposed on Japan, we'll be able to, manage one way or another to avoid Japanese people go crazy, because I mean, something that hasn't changed since 1930s is that Japan depends heavily on the energy and the food. So if there is, so we recognize the vulnerability. We understand that we are vulnerable. So we always need to think of these kind of economic coercion. We are vulnerable to these economic coercion or economic sanctions. So we need to think of how to mitigate those risks.
All right. Counterpoint, Ariane.
I guess I'm going to step out of my role as a co-host for a second, and perhaps as a guest to slightly challenge this point. From my viewpoint here in China, I feel like many people really do see this as a through line from World War II, and the development of the modern economic weapon through Russia since its 2014 invasion of Crimea to today. Scholars based in Beijing, including at the China Academy of Sciences, uh, often look at Russia and Western sanctions on Russia since 2014 as a prelude to both what's already going on and what may be to come. And then they look at Russia's internal autarkic reaction to Western sanctions to draw lessons on what China could do to prepare in advance for potential loss of technologies that it currently relies on the West for. Do you think there may be a disconnect between Western capitals and Beijing in how they view the through lines of history and the use of sanction, and how Russia compares to past examples?
The sanctions against Russia is basically the punishable. I mean, it's a punitive sanctions against Russia, and what is happening in China is not a prelude to the war. It's just simply, try to prevent the transfer of technology to China and try to maintain the superiority of the West on the semiconductor. Uh, the big difference is that there is still a lot of trade going on between Japan and China, or United States and China. So this is not the sanctions at all. This is not the punitive actions from the Chinese side. Yes, it seems punitive because the being being as China as already a crime from United States point of view, but it's not really the way in which that the sanctions work. I mean, um, if China
Yep.
invades Taiwan, then there will be a punishable. The punitive sanctions will be imposed. But again, sanctions is always the two ways street. I mean, if you impose sanctions on China, then it would have a significant impact on Japan, US, South Korea, or everybody else. So, I think there is always a dynamics within the country that imposing the sanctions requires some sort of a national consensus to justify the pain in your country. So, when you stop importing, I mean, look at what happened in Europe. They depend heavily on the natural gas and oil from Russia, and they impose sanctions because of the Ukraine invasion in Ukraine. This was a punitive sanctions, stopping imports from, stopping import of the natural gas from Russia, which ended up in a very high price of the fuel, high fuel price in Europe. But that has to, the Europe has to live with that. because that's their decision to impose sanctions. I mean, imposing sanctions on China is unthinkable. I mean, it's not prelude to anything. I mean, that has a total different meaning. It requires a lot of pain in your country. I mean, in the United States, in Japan. So I think, I don't know what Chinese are looking at, what the current situation, but certainly this is not the sanctions. Certainly this is not the painful decision already taken to in expense of achieving something. So I think my understanding is that China feel that they are under pressure, but in the macro stream, I mean, if you look at all the numbers, then China and the United States is still trading heavily. Um, you know, China is still the number one trading partner in Japan. So that's not that's not sanctions. That's
Yeah.
just simply setting a bar on the semiconductor. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, I think, coming back to the 1930s, just because I think it's really interesting. You had the U.S. and Japan that had like dramatically, you had real trading relationships and real dependencies, and the sort of the FDR kind of started slow, right,
Yeah.
with stuff that was most, he had like the equivalent of like semiconductor manufacturing equipment export controls on specific sort of like minerals and imports that
Hmm.
were only really going into like fighter jets and stuff. And of course, over the course of the 1930s, with what Japan kept doing in East and Southeast Asia, like that led to a ratcheting up, which ultimately got you to oil, which got you to December 1941. I mean, I guess sort of we can hope that you don't end up following a pattern where semiconductor export controls is in some like ugly feedback loop with Chinese policymakers where they decide, oh, the game is already over. They're coming for us anyways. Let's just like continue to be more obnoxious in our neighborhood and ultimately kind of give the rest of the world all the more reason to do more and more stuff to control China's access to technology and materials. I am hopeful. I guess Ariane is maybe a little more pessimistic, and maybe hopefully there are just some academics trying to write some fun papers at CAS to get headlines in red. But it would take being pretty conspiratorial to see a trillions of dollars in trade flows and like this one small thing having been cut off over the past few years and kind of extrapolate that to like a coming, dramatic economic war or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just for the footnotes, I mean, the 1930s or today, Japan is dependent on the foreign trade anyhow. And
Yeah.
Japan is heavily dependent on, Japan is least autonomous in terms of the manufacturing. When it comes to the equipment, so, the, the rubber and the, oil and the lubricants and everything. Um, China is more autonomous in a way that of course they depend on food and energy, but you know China
They
is
got a pig
more.
reserve.
Yeah, they have a big reserve. They have the depths of their reserves, um and all. I don't think China is depending on United States on in terms of oil or food. Yes, food was dependent, but because of the Trump trade war, the China is finding the alternative source in Brazil and Argentina. There's much less capabilities of United States to impose sanctions on China. And I think that's different from the situation in 1930s in Japan. So I think the degree of the dependence is the defining moment or the defining factor of the relationship or effectiveness of the sanctions. And in that regard, I think, you know, and again, sanctions always you have to spare your blood on imposing sanctions. So I mean, the degree of the dependency of China is much less than the Japan in 1930s, and the power of the or effectiveness of the sanctions are much less. Japan is an island country, whereas China is a continental country, so it has a lot of loopholes and connectivities. So I I can't really come up with this sort of a similarity on these two, and I
All right.
think it's really irrelevant, and I think it is misleading to use the 1930s as an example of the consequences of imposing sanctions against another.
I'm sold. Okay, so you've seen some. You mentioned the effectiveness of Russian export, sort of like the Russian sanctioned regime. There have been some pretty damning articles coming out of Nikkei and Der Spiegel of DGM Mori machines showing up in
Uh-huh.
Chinese atomic development and sort of Russian artillery manufacturing capacities. Like how mad are you as a METI person when you see that stuff? Is this like a political scandal in China as well? What's up with the machine tools?
It was basically regarded as a laziness of the German uh, regulatory uh, officials. I mean, there was an agreement at the Wassenaar level that this machine tool was supposed to be on the list and needs to be controlled. And somewhat, the Japanese authority has already stopped the DGM Mori to not to export to China, but the German let it go. So I think it was a German subsidiary exported to China, and it was supposed to be the responsibility of the German authority to control that. But it didn't happen. Companies have different places to export, different places exporting from. The China or anybody who wants to get the access to the machine wants to find the weakest link. And the most important thing about the multilateral export control regime is that don't be the weakest link, um, because you'll be exploited. I mean that was the case. So that I'm not. I mean the DMG Mori may be very mad, but I mean, as a METI, I mean, I'm not a METI person, but if I put myself in the shoes of a METI person, I think I'm not that mad.
Okay. Um, Nippon Steel.
Yeah.
They tried to buy U.S. steel. I forget if it was Biden, but definitely Ambassador Emanuel came out very much in favor of it. We had some
Mhm.
pushback from senators and politicians, and now Biden's like, I'm not so
Yeah.
into this. Like, does this really like? I think it's kind of dumb. But I'm also unclear about like just how big a deal it is.
It's a bigger deal. It's a big deal in Japan. It's been news almost every day. The Nippon Steel is trying to convince the USW, the Union Steel Workers, or they are hiring the most expensive lobbyist in Washington D.C. Top 10
Well, they haven't
lobbyists.
they haven't bought ads on Chinatalk yet, and I'm a little offended. So come on, guys, get with the
Yeah, well,
program.
well, they are using the discourse that this is for the economic security, etc., etc. So, there's a lot of recovery shots from the Nippon Steel, but I think it was a sort of I mean, this is a public space, so I wouldn't use that sort of language that may offend anybody. But I don't think this was the right timing.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think it's like, it's a tricky thing, right? Cuz like US Steel is basically like a really sad, depressed national champion, which is just
Yeah,
going to die.
yeah,
And like you say you're protecting jobs in Pennsylvania. It's like they promised to hire more people and pay them
yeah,
better wages. And you
yeah.
can write that into the like approval agreement for
Hmm.
CFIUS or whatever. So
Mm.
it is like pretty stupid, but it's also 6 months before a presidential election, and
Yeah.
I totally understand the Biden administration's rationale of being like, look, like even if this is like a half or like a third of a percent chance that you end up losing Pennsylvania for
Hmm.
this, like, is it worth it to like have Trump in the White House? Like, absolutely not. So, um, anyways, kind of dumb, but it's all
Yeah.
right.
Let me just be the sort of a advocate of the Nippon Steel side. There was a chance. I mean, this all started from this, Article 232, and this put the Japanese steelmakers in a very bad position because if you try to export, you have to pay 25% taxes, tariffs. So it's a practically a barrier to the U.S. market. So in order to overcome this barrier, either to forget about this additional tariff, or just try and invest in the U.S. market. Suddenly, U.S. Steel is on the market, and the Cleveland Cliff was trying to buy it and failed. So, the next chance, Nippon Steel, this is a golden opportunity to have this, the production site in United States, and there's a boom because of the IRA. There's a lot of investment of the European automakers, the South Koreans, Japanese are now investing in Ohio, Kentucky, and elsewhere. There's a lot of the electric car manufacturers coming in, so there's a huge demand creating in U.S. market, and but you can't export your product to United States because of the 232. So this is the dumbest situation. And for the Nippon Steel, there's no way but to buy American company, and U.S. Steel is on the market, and that's the golden opportunity. But unfortunately, it was just 6 months before the presidential election, so it was a bad timing. But I think it is the 232 which makes all the problem bad.
Gotcha. All right, let's close on some happy stuff. We've taken enough of our vegetables with World War II and whatnot over the course of this conversation. What's exciting about Japan's space program?
Well, space program is now exciting. I mean, the budget is tripled since 2015. I mean, the Japanese are, because of this K-Pro and the strategic strategic funds, and SBIR, which is to support the space venture. There's a lots and lots of money available for investing in space. Now we are, together with the United States, we are now moving on to the Artemis program. We don't know when, but we have the sort of a guaranteed promise that the United States will carry 2 Japanese astronauts to the surface of the moon. So this will be the first non-American astronauts landing on the moon. So Japanese will be the first ones. So that's an excitement. Japan is now, finally we were able to launch H3 rocket. I mean, the H3 is not yet competitive against SpaceX, but still, there is a huge demand for the satellite launch, and there is only viable launching option in the SpaceX. So SpaceX launches almost 100 times per year, but still, there's a surpluses of this demand. So, Japanese H3 may be able to capture some of those demand. And yes, so we are doing really, really good, and hopefully, we can continue sort of a thriving this new space era, particularly with the commercialization, and bringing up these commercial ventures. My favorite, well, I used to be the in the executive board, so certainly this is my favorite. But my favorite space company is the Astroscale, which is to reduce, take out the space debris commercially. So they are doing a lot of interesting things. Um, and this is something that Japan is the first country to build the satellite for removing the space debris from the orbit. So if this company is successful, then it will create a lot of avenue. It opens up the door of the potential commercialization of these, sort of, let's say, salvage activities in space, or doing the refuel or repair of satellite in space. And so there's a lot of possible options for possible services that this company can provide. So I think there's a lot of exciting prospect on the Japanese space side.
Yeah. Well, I feel bad for any launch company after Starship really gets going, but
Yeah,
firms who can sort of leverage like the incredible economics that are about to come online to putting stuff in the sky have a really exciting decade ahead of them.
yeah.
How is Elon viewed in Japan?
Well, generally speaking, he's an entrepreneur. He's a guy who does a lot of things and everything successful. Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink, you know. But he's also being a sort of a weird guy. You know, friend of Trump, buying a Twitter and making it sort of the wild west, and it's a sort of a disruptive person in many sense, technologically and socially disruptive. So I think he's breaking down the social norms, which doesn't really create a good impression in Japan. And I think he is regarded as the genius with the bad characteristics.
I guess so. Speaking of Elon and Twitter, you and many others in the Japanese sort of policy community are addicted to the platform, which is kind of sort of an exciting, like weird through the looking glass thing as someone who also spends an outrageous amount of time on Twitter. Any sort of reflections on similarities and differences between how I guess like what your experience of like the Japanese policy debate on Twitter has been relative to what you see in the Anglo world?
Well, I think I don't see much differences, but I think the quality of debate are different. I mean, in the not in the you know. I don't think that the Anglo world is better than Japanese world or vice versa. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that Japanese Twitter has its own sort of a character. I don't know. I mean, I think there are some sort of the policymakers trying to be very less controversial and try to stay out of the debate. Sometimes there are sort of a aggressive right wing conspiracy theorists just using Twitter and disseminating these their own theory. But I think this is not expanding as much as you can think of in the United States. There are some sort of I mean, there are echo chambers, but echo chambers are very, very small. And I don't think it would have the sort of similar impact on the Facebook as well as Twitter or any social media that creates some sort of a huge gathering of what happened in the January 6th. And I think you know that's the Japanese are more kind of a relative to what other people are saying. So it's uh, the I would say the conformity in Japan is much less than in the United States, in my view. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not expert on this.
Well, you're as an expert as anyone is. I mean, what do you mean by like the relative? Japan is more relative.
Well, Japan is more relative in terms of not subscribing to the certain extreme idea.
Oh,
Japanese
gotcha.
people do not choose right or wrong. They are more relative to, okay, there are some, some people say this, some people say that, but you know, they are not subscribing to the either side. So that what I try to mean.
Gotcha. Last one on this, just because I think it's kind of fascinating. So in the US, like I feel like Twitter is kind of dying in the policy discussion. Like it's
Hmm.
starting to feel a little more lonely out there. Is that the same thing in Japan, or do you think the usage is like basically the same among the, whatever political
Well,
discussion class?
yeah. Well, basically, I think Japan is still more healthier in terms of using Twitter as the platform for providing the ideas for the policies, and I think it's less of a debate. I mean, the often what happens is that there is a little public debate over certain policies. Some people are just simply, announcing their position, and some people are saying something else. But these are sort of not debated in the social media space, and it is more like you have the different propositions, different exhibitions of the different policy threats, and people just choose, have a choice, have an option to see the spectrum of the debate, and then people may choose to which part of the argument to be to follow. So yeah, I think that's the kind of sense that I feel.
Awesome. Well, this was a really fantastic discussion. Thank you so much
All
for being
right.
a part of China Talk.